Welcome to the True Sight podcast by Oracle's Elixir, your source for in-depth analytical coverage of professional League of Legends and the rest of the esports world. I'm Tim Magic Sevenhusen, and joining me today is Dignitas' division coach, Jimmy Harrison. Welcome to the show, Jimmy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you are the division coach of Dignitas. I guess a lot of people would more typically label you the head coach, but that's the term you guys use. I think it'd be great to give people a little bit of insight just to start off with kind of who you are in the team, what your responsibilities are, what that title actually means.
Sure. So as far as division coach goes, it's a title that I'm pretty sure only Dignitas is using right now. Most of my responsibilities would be the same as the expectations you would have for a head coach. A lot of my daily responsibilities are the same as what I was doing on Golden Guardians when I was a head coach. I think the main differences are I'm involved more at a managerial level as well. As far as like the head of esports, when they were hiring me at Dignitas, a lot of my value came from the league context I could bring. So not just necessarily inside the game, but what goes into infrastructure or things that have worked or haven't worked in the past for league teams. So I kind of have my hands involved in everything. So it's a bit more all-encompassing, I would say, than just a head coach where people say, okay, well, you draft and that's it or something.
Yeah. So, and you came to Dignitas, as you mentioned, having come from Golden Guardians and doing some other things before that. What's kind of the quick overview of kind of the career arc that's brought you here, the teams you've worked with and what you've done with them?
Sure. So I started in NA Challenger. So before franchising actually happened, I worked for a team called Big God's Jackals, which was originally a Brazilian team that was trying to qualify for LCS. Did that for a split, and then through my connections there, through the Brazilian owners, head coach, and two of the players, as soon as that team didn't qualify, I started working remotely to try to help out with a Brazilian team called CNB. And within a couple weeks of working remotely, they asked, hey, are you able to get a visa and come to Brazil, by the way? Because we think you'd be a good head coach. So I just kind of speed around that process. Got my visa, went down to Brazil, did 2 splits there, had some good playoff runs, barely missed out on Worlds. And then through that, I made some connections with some of the guys at Golden Guardians, interviewed there, initially hired as a 2A player coach. Then 4 weeks into Spring Split 2019, I actually was moved up to be the head coach. I continued doing that in summer 2019. And then last year, I transitioned over to a more player performance role. So trying to focus on more of the support staff aspects or things that go into players outside of just the game. And then from that, I kind of had an itch to want to go back to the competitive side of being a head coach, I guess, and wanting to try to apply a lot of what I'd felt I'd learned over the last few years. And Dignitas was a great opportunity for me to do that.
What does the overall coaching staff at Dignitas look like? If you're overseeing kind of the group of who the staff are and what they do, what is that kind of org chart and where do you sit within it?
Sure. So currently you have me just kind of just overlooking the LCS side, academy side, amateur. Below me, we have our strategic coach, Josh Mabry, so TSM's former strategic coach from this last year. My analyst, Jim Morrison, who's jumped around in a couple teams. He was on Echo Fox, and then he was on Dignitas last year. We have Invert, who's in Academy. He's kind of in charge of Academy and both amateur, when I'm mostly focusing on LCS. And then we're looking to try to build out some positional staff, some player performance in addition to that, but that's the core of what we have right now.
Great. When you came to Dignitas in this offseason, and the announcement was a little bit later in the offseason, but of course we don't know from the outside necessarily kind of where you actually started getting involved in the team pre-announcement. Were you involved in kind of building out this roster and selecting the players to come in, or did you kind of come in after that process?
Yeah, I was involved in the process. I think anyone who knows any of my history, well, I guess you wouldn't know any of my history because it's not really public, but all of my announcements are just scuffed anyways. But I was involved in the offseason. When I initially joined, Dignitas was all in on really wanting to build around Aframu and Dardoch. What they saw from last year, they felt like they were 2 really solid core pieces that they felt had potential. And I was tasked with trying to build around those guys and try to build something that made sense amidst a COVID environment where a lot of budget cuts were happening across the board for LCS teams. So yeah, I was involved in the process, and it was pretty fun trying to figure out different routes we could go as far as how much we were going to invest, if we wanted to go with a more veteran presence, if we wanted to go a more developmental route, which is inevitably what we ended up doing.
Yeah, so walk us through a little bit of that process. I'm sure there are certain things you can't lift the curtain on too much, but when you start from, it sounds like you started from the position of we've got Dardoch, we've got Aframu, and we're going to build out the rest of it from there. How do you lay out your priorities of, here's our plan A, plan B, plan C, you know, who do you talk to? How do you figure out what your overall game plan is in the direction you're trying to go?
You initially start out, you try to check all the contracts. You have an idea of who's going to be available, how long their contracts are currently at. You try to think about what your expectations and plans are for short term and long term. For me, I think a lot of my perspective comes from the experience I had working with Dana at Golden Guardians. He's someone who I respect a lot. I think he's really smart as far as how you go about building a team that can be successful competitively, and then how that transitions into what your brand becomes. So from my perspective, it was just laying out, okay, there's a couple options where we can go with some name brand veterans, which I think was the route that Dignitas took last year, signing guys like Froggen as an example. And that can just boost your social media, can boost people talking about you because you have a big name. And then the other direction was just trying to balance out, okay, if we don't go for bigger names and we take chances on some younger guys, are we getting pieces that we think have the potential to be really good within 1 to 2 years? And for me, that's something that's just appealing based on my previous experience. The last roster I was a head coach on, I would say was the complete opposite, where it was a lot more veteran names who'd been around for a while, Froggen, Hunter, Ole, definitely in contracts. There's a lot of experience on that roster, and there's a lot of pros and cons that come with that. And for me, in the back of my head, I was just wondering, okay, well, what would it feel like if I could dial back a bit and take some guys that are more undeveloped, and what would that look like in a long term and a short term? And it just started to sound more and more fun the more I was listening to players that were more unproven or had maybe negative narratives, and thinking about how we could turn those things around.
Yeah, so I think if you really oversimplified this process, I think most people would look at it and say, okay, the first thing you have to kind of decide is, what is our overarching game plan? Like, are we trying to, like, again, really oversimplifying it, are we trying to win right now, you know, and have the absolute best team we can right now? Are we trying to build an arc that makes us win the most we can, like in 1 year from now or 2 years from now? Are we trying to get the biggest fan base we can? And I'd say those are probably the three core ones that most people from the outside would look at. And again, very heavily boiling it down. Sure. Is that something that you guys kind of had conversations about and kind of picked a core direction and then went from there? Or was it a little more organic and a little more kind of reactionary to the way the market actually played out?
I think part of it comes down to context that I think fans are missing in general, which is the investment process and like what those investment dollars are going towards. So from a top-down perspective, I don't think there's a lot of teams where it's just one guy picking the players. There's a lot of involvement from ownership and what they're trying to accomplish, right? So for LCS orgs, they're investing and their expectation is esports is going to boom. And all of them want to be able to establish their brand as fast as possible, right? There's definitely different ways you can go about doing that. I think for our perspective, or at least mine specifically, I don't want to speak to everyone else, but my mindset is always, okay, if I can be competitive with a compelling narrative, I think that's where you start to build up your brand. So a lot of what I was just trying to push for was give me the opportunity to get some younger, flexible players that I can build around, Aframu and Dardoch, and let me show you what I can do in a year, and then in 2 years, you'll be surprised.
Okay, and did you feel like there's a lot of really good consensus in the, as you say, there was a group of people that kind of set that direction? It's not only yourself, but also management, ownership, and so on. Does that come to like a consensus forming process, and then you start making your decisions from that, or is it a constant conversation at every step?
Ideally, it's a constant conversation for sure. I think when you understand the context for when I was joining, I also didn't have a lot of runway for how much time I could have.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sprint where it's just like, okay, you guys have been working on things on your end as far as, you know, who you think a good head coach would be, what players you're interested in. For me, I spent the last 2 years just thinking about, okay, if I get my chance to build up a team or if I'm head coaching again, who are some players that I think I'd like to work with? And then it was just spending a lot of time with the general manager to be like, okay, let's check out what the contracts actually look at. Let's talk about what the budget is and what's actually possible. Here's a couple different scenarios. Based on those scenarios, here are expectations we think we'd have for them in a 1 to 2 year period. Mm-hmm. And then obviously you have to be able to shift with how the market is going, what's available and what's not, right? You're not in control of everything.
Yeah. I think there's a perception from outside of the teams, you know, say among the fan base, that that certain things in the process happen and then budget got pulled out, you know, partway through the roster building process, for, you know, people like to talk about the NBA backed teams and so on, and some of Dignitas ownership falls into that. Is that accurate, or like did budget numbers actually get changed on you partway through the process, or is that just a total false perception?
I don't know how transparent I want to be,
fair enough,
just to be fair to the people above me, but I do think if you look at during COVID, I mean, it was a really volatile situation. You could tell companies, not even just in esports, were unsure of how the market was going to change. I think it's reasonable when you consider the gamble that is esports right now to be able to dial back on esports compared to some of the other ventures. So the numbers weren't always 100% clear, but for the most part, we had an idea of what we were working with. There wasn't a player that we ran into where it's just like, yep, can't afford him, impossible. But at the same time, we're also not going to be considering guys like Perks that are worth like 4 times my roster during COVID, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair. So given where it all did land, I think you guys ended up bringing in FakeGod, Soligo, and Neo to round out the rest of your roster. How would you describe like what kind of team that roster is meant to be? Like, again, if you're gonna like simplify down into kind of one of those archetypes of the win now, the develop for later, the build a brand, kind of thing. Like, how would you write the narrative of the roster you built?
I would definitely argue that it's more on the side of development. I think that there's this narrative that I don't have development players because of the experience some of my guys have had on 100T or the 4 games Neo played on Optic. For me, I feel like this is just really short-sighted. I think a lot of fans don't really understand the difference between genuine experience when a team is all in on you and giving you a realistic chance compared to getting thrown into a team straight out of proving grounds that's just on fire. I think there's a very big difference for players and how they can grow and the pressure that they're under. For us, I think we have 3 young guys that have a pretty good baseline, especially from Soligo and FakeGod, their time in Academy. And honestly, even Neo, they've had time to kind of build up some of those weaknesses and build up some of their confidence. But for us, we have a long way to go. And a lot of the appeal is being able to give them stage time versus a lot of veterans that have been in the game for a while, giving them time to be able to kind of understand what kind of players they want to be. So I would say, especially from like a Dignitas perspective, I mean, you should be excited that we're trying players that I think have a lot of potential and are exciting to watch. I mean, even if our games are going to be sloppy and we're for sure going to take some really wacky losses, and even in some of our wins, it's going to look wacky. It should be exciting watching a team just genuinely try to work together and try to grow. I think we want to play a fast-paced game. We want to fight a lot. I think we've shown that in our games so far. We've had some pretty quick games. But yeah, it's going to take time. It's definitely more on the development side.
How would you describe kind of the makeup of the roster in terms of like, I think you look at the different styles different players play, and you kind of say, okay, our team is built around an aggressive jungler or a high resource bot lane or whatever that's going to be. Do you feel like you guys have a fairly clear identity that way?
I think we're still trying to establish what our identity is. A lot of what I wanted to try to accomplish was to get a flexible team that I think can kind of mold based on how the meta is changing. I think historically NA boils down to a certain style, a very like slow front to back, low risk kind of style, especially once you get towards playoffs. And from my perspective, I always felt like this was a really limiting way to play the game. Especially when you have a player like Dardoch, who I think he has a lot of creativity. Obviously, he's kind of flexing his champion pool on stage right now. You want to be able to lean into those things. But in order to do that, you need lanes that are also flexible and willing to do that and kind of enjoy problem solving and just trying to play a more diverse style. But that being said, like I said before, when it comes to developing, a lot of our young guys are still just trying to figure out who they are on stage, what kind of players they're going to be. I definitely wouldn't say like we're obviously top side or obviously bot focused. Our recent results are showing that we play pretty well around bot lane and objective control. And obviously we're playing a lot around Dardoch and what he's picking, but that can change just depending on what we think is good in the current meta, right?
So let's talk about some of the individual players, from the perspective of this kind of flexibility. I think like FakeGod would be the first one that I would look at and say, and top lane is generally a very flexible role. Or do you have a very high, a lane dominant top laner? Do you have a carry top laner? Or do you have a, the classic weak side description? Tell me about FakeGod's flexibility and what kind of roles, how well you think he's suited to different kinds of roles within a team comp.
I would say, honestly, one of the biggest appeals to FakeGod and why I was so drawn to wanting to work with him is because I think he can do both. I think historically, a lot of the veteran top laners in North America are known for being predominantly strong side or predominantly weak side, which again, inevitably that's going to be limiting for you. Yeah. In addition to that, I think it's just a good balance of ego where it's confidence in gameplay, but not confident to the point where you're not willing to try to change your opinion or view on things when your teammates think, hey, could you try something else? I love working with Aaron. I think this kid's a turbo smurf, to be honest. So far in LCS, we've kind of left him out to dry to be on weak side. I think he's getting a bit of the someday treatment where we're playing around bot a lot. So top lane's just on an island and it's just do your job, show up when you're supposed to. But that being said, when the meta shifts or if we see a good angle where we can play around top side, we feel confident playing through FakeGod.
What did you see from him in kind of the academy side of things? Did you see a little bit more of that, of a player you could invest resources into, or like where and when have you seen that kind of that element of his game show up?
Sure. So I think when you look at this offseason and when it came to people and evaluating academy talent, I think a lot of people tunneled on Cloud9 Academy solo laners, right? So Fudge and Palafox. For good reason. I think both players are talented. I think if you're actually watching the games, if you're spectating, you'd recognize that 100T solo lanes were also performing well, not only against them, but just against the league in general. I would argue both the solo laners were the strong point of that 100T team. And then throughout the scouting process, once you dive into some internal VODs and you start to hear what the comms sound like and you see what they look like when they're playing their LCS team internally, as an example, some of these things start to shine through where it's like, okay, this kid can play strong side and he can play weak side. He just needs time to learn how to play a team game. He needs to learn the communication structure. He needs to figure out what went wrong with him in 2019 when he got thrown into the fire. And I think a lot of what he showed in Academy was he took a lot of lessons from his time on 100T, for better or worse, where he had a clear idea of what he wanted to work on, what he wanted to get better at. And I think you could see that 100T Academy team trusted him to be that player.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't expect a player like him to come into a lineup with Dardoch and Aframu with all their experience and leadership and be leading the comms. So it does make sense that that he'd be picking that up from them and learning from them, like what his role is in those comms. And top lane, from the nature of the role, seems like one where there's rare, very important information to communicate, right? Like it's not a role like support that you'd expect to be talking as frequently and shaping the rest or jungle in that case. Is that somewhere where like you think that him as a top laner, that he has a certain structure in any team's comms that he has to learn, or do you guys do comms kind of different from what you think other teams might do?
Like all players, I mean, he has a lot to learn as far as comms and how he works in the team. I feel like while it's true top lane's probably going to talk less than support is, especially during your early and mid game, I don't necessarily think that means top lane's job is just to say I have TP or I don't have TP. I think especially in NA when you criticize teams for being weak at side lanes as an example, I think a lot of that comes down to top laners either not understanding how to play their waves or not understanding how to communicate what they need. And for Aaron, he learns really fast. So while it's true he'll lean on Afro and Dardoch for comms and for a general idea of what should be happening, he picks up things really quickly, and you can tell he's just getting more and more comfortable for when he can call for resources or when he should take more of a back seat. A lot of that's just going to depend on the comps that we're drafting and what's required of him. But this goes back to me just thinking he's a really flexible player that's just willing to kind of do anything it takes to win as a team, which is why I value him so much, right?
Sure. Let's talk about Soligo a little bit. I think, watching Academy last year, there was quite a group of mid laners in that league who seemed to be at relatively similar levels. And it was, I'd say it wasn't until quite near the end of the year that Palafox kind of jumped up and caught everybody's attention, as Cloud9 Academy went on and kind of ran away with things as an entire team. And I think that helps the individual player, especially the mid laner, look really good. But you had a big pack of other mid laners who, without spending dozens of hours watching each of them very closely, it's kind of hard to differentiate their level. What was it about Soligo that caught your eyes and said he's the one out of that pack that we want to work with?
Sure. I'd agree with your take that I think a lot of the top Academy mid laners were of relative skill. I think despite being of relative skill, I think they have different strengths and weaknesses, whether it's champion pool or what they're naturally inclined to want to play as far as like what their play style is. For Soligo, there's a couple things. The first one was having an innate relationship with FakeGod already. Those guys came up together through Proving Ground, or Scouting Grounds rather, straight into 100T Academy. They essentially played for 2 years together, and they've only played together. I think that's something that is underrated as far as when you're taking players and you're telling them, hey, we're really invested in you and we trust you. Just take your time in LCS and try to get experience. That's easier said than done. And I think it's nice to be able to have a teammate that you're already familiar with, that you're comfortable with, not only in the game, but just outside of the game too. I think some of Max's greatest strengths are he's just a very analytical thinker. I think he's a really smart kid. And when he's trying to think about lane or what his role in the game, you can tell he's trying to figure out what the dichotomy is, what the black and white answers are to figure things out. And you can tell when things make sense in his head, he looks like a completely different player. I would say the Zoe game we just played this last weekend, even if I would say it was a clown fiesta in general, I thought Max really stood out in his Zoe game. You could tell, okay, this kid's solid on this champion. The fun part about Max, in my opinion, is just you can tell that from his time on 100T till now, he's just gone through a lot of self-reflection. He's listening to what people think are negative about him, or he's thinking about the criticisms, and he's trying to figure out what kind of player he wants to be. The thing that stands out for him outside of just gameplay, I would say, is just the flexibility and how much he buys into the team culture that I want. where it's I want players to be able to trust each other. I want players that aren't afraid to go out and mess up, and I want players that are just trying to figure out, okay, how do we play the game together? And for me, I feel like I have two solo laners, especially when I consider how they work with Dardoch, having a player that has a ton of experience and a lot of different styles he can play. That flexibility is just really appealing to me. So I think about it, it's like I'm almost adding in one solo laner instead of two, just because they've been on the same page for so long, which is, I thought it was just an interesting thing that we could try for this year, to be honest. And so far, I feel like it's been pretty good.
Yeah. How has the partnership been developing between him and Dardoch? Because, I think mid and jungle is something that people talk about a lot. And especially then if you're talking about, the top and mid have some existing kind of relationship and then you're fitting the jungle in, to work with that entire kind of half of the map to play or, how the top side's going to play. How have they been kind of connecting with Dardoch and how's that relationship developing?
I think they've been connecting well, and the development process started really early. I heard some teams talking about how early they were starting practice, but I think a lot of people don't realize that we were already starting internals before most teams, from my understanding. We were already trying to put time into making sure that they were duo queuing, that we were playing internals so we can try to get an idea of how the players would fit together. I think Dardoch, he's really misunderstood and I would say just underrated as far as what he can offer to players. He's worked with a lot of good players. He's jumped around at different teams and that experience adds up. And when you're bringing in a player like Soligo, who had made a lot of improvements in academy, but still needed to be able to figure out how he functions on an LCS team, how he can communicate around his lane. There's a lot of things that Josh can share from having worked with a bunch of different mid laners, right? Like in previous years or in previous splits or in these matchups, this is how teammates would communicate things, or this is how you should be thinking about something. So things like that. I think it's been pretty good overall.
So we've talked about FakeGod, talked about Soligo. Let's talk a little bit about Neo, the other player that you guys brought in. He was playing under the name Asta before. This was an internal promotion, correct?
Yep.
And was that an easier decision to make because you guys had, the org had been working with him before and it was kind of a natural promotion? Like tell me about the decision making process for promoting him versus maybe some other options that might have been on the market.
Sure. It's hard to say if it's just easier or not, even if it's easier in the sense that I would have more context from talking to different staff members or players that were around to be able to understand the player a bit more. The scouting process, usually you try to reach out and you just try to poke around and get different perspectives of players as far as like just what your eye test is. For Neo, the thing that stood out was just there was a lot of confidence in him across the board, especially just in his mechanics. I think outside of the mechanics, just being a really good teammate overall. In my opinion, I think the biggest thing that held Neo back from being able to get chances, well, the first one was him inting in scouting grounds and just not checking his email and just not going to the first one where he should have been there, and the same one Tactical was in. But the second one was just his English was the thing that people would call out. And I think it's similar to Tony Top on EG. He was a player where people would say, okay, this guy has mechanics, but we've heard his English might not be that strong. And then during this offseason, you start to see like the pro in-houses with comms and people are like, wait, this sounds okay. Like you can work with this, right? Neo actually played on a team with Tony Top originally before Optic as well. So I think both their progresses have been kind of similar, or the process and them getting closer and closer to the LCS. But as soon as I started going back and digging through VODs of Dignitas internally and on stage, and I was just watching how he was able to internalize what people were saying, how he was responding, and then also just recognizing the in-game skill, it just became more and more exciting to be like, okay, this makes sense. And then when you think about Afro's track record with working with younger AD carries, that's another safe bet you can make, where I think Zach does a great job working with young guys and just getting them on the same page. When you realize bot lane is all about it's all about a relationship and just trying to get on the same page, so you're basically functioning as one person. This is something without question I think that Afro does really well. So we thought it would be a really exciting pairing to be like, okay, let's give you another chance to work with someone that's young that has hands, and let's see what we can build out of that. And so far, Neo's been amazing to work with.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that kind of mentorship a little bit more, because there is this track record of Afro doing this with a lot of different players. Johnson most recently, but others before that as well. How much improvement have you seen since those two started working together, Afro and Neo, and how much more do you think there is ahead that they can grow into?
I feel like we're just scratching the surface, to be honest. When you realize, one, the difficulty of having duo queue removed, I think that's something that's going to limit fresh bot lanes when they start playing together. Essentially, the best way to do it is you're playing your duo queue series and then you're just dodging master tier promo, so you can just stay at Diamond 1 but still play with Master, Challenger, MMR, and then you sit in 40-minute queues just to try to grind it out. That's a limiting factor that didn't exist in the past. But I would say overall, they do a really good job talking outside of the game about the small details in lane, things that they want to work on. And I think we're barely showing what they're capable of, to be honest. So far, it's been a balance of them trying to get a feel for each other. I think there's always going to be an interesting balance when you take a player who hasn't really accomplished that much and you pair them with a veteran that's accomplished a lot. They kind of have to figure out how to get on the same page. It's not always the case where the veteran knows everything and is always going to be right? You don't want that kind of relationship. You want it still to be a back and forth. But I think both of them just have such positive personalities, and it shows up where in our games, our bot lane tends to be our rock for us, where they're just very consistent. And I think a lot of that just comes down to the personalities meshing really well, to be honest.
I think you look at some of the top end bot laners in LCS, the pairings there. You look at Sven and Vulcan, you look at Tactical and Core JJ, something like this. Do you guys look at the pairing you have and say, we can reach that level, we can match into that group or even exceed them? And is that the goal? Does that have to be the goal?
With time, yeah, for sure. For me, even if I say, we have a development roster and the plan is to be really competitive 2 years from now, I also think we can take games off anyone right now. It's just a matter of being able to build out consistency and trying to get a system that works for us and establishing what our team identity is. It's not always going to be easy for an individual or a bot lane duo to shine when the overall team is still trying to figure out how they want to push the game together. That takes time. But on an individual mechanical level, I think there's no question that they can get at that level. It's just a matter of how we go about that process, how hard we're working, trying to make sure we have really good quality practice so we can keep building these things up, making sure we're retaining when we do mess up. I think that's the most important thing as a development roster. It's not about just taking new players and throwing them into the LCS and saying, good luck, have fun, and then just, okay, yeah, you might lose and hopefully you learn. I think a lot of it is trying to make sure you're guiding them to be like, okay, when we do take our losses, what are our takeaways to make sure that we're actually getting stronger game after game, right? And I think with the bot duo that we have, they're just both really open-minded about what their strengths and weaknesses are and how they want to work together. So I have a lot of confidence that we'll be a contender with them.
How much outside of the individual gameplay and in-game mechanics and even team comms and stuff like that, how much are Dardoch and Ephraim doing as mentors for the outside of the game things? Getting very kind of cliche-ish, like how to be a pro, the way to conduct yourself, that kind of thing. Is that somewhere where that they're also helping these guys kind of integrate into the LCS more?
Absolutely. And honestly, I don't think it's a cliche at all. I think that's just something that's true, and it's really valuable when you have veterans that have a lot of experience that are willing to share those things. Oftentimes you have veterans who've been around the league for a few years, but they're not necessarily doing a good job sharing those experiences or trying to teach or trying to say, hey, this worked for me or didn't work for me in the past. Outside of the game, well, actually, I can even go back to when it came down to roster building. A lot of our roster came about through conversations with myself, Dardoch, and Afro, talking about, okay, well, what do we want to build together, right? What kind of players do we think mesh well with them and work with their personalities? And the big things that would constantly come up would be just flexibility and then having talkers, having a team that actually feels like a family that can have fun playing together. A lot of it was us trying to work together to talk about what do we think we wanted in younger players if we were going to go that route. And the big thing I would constantly talk about is like, there's a difference between just having veterans and saying you're a leader because you're a veteran and then setting your veterans up to actually be leaders. I think in the case for both Ephraim and Dardoch, they have the potential to be fantastic leaders. They're already showing it right now, but they have a lot of room to grow in that regard. Teaching them different ways they can communicate or share information or how they're giving feedback or how they're guiding guys along. We take a lot of time outside of the game just talking about in-game stuff, things outside of the game as far as, okay, you need to be more serious about your sleep schedule and trying to maintain consistency, right? So trying to make sure that when you're showing up to practice, you're not tired and just wasting games. I think both of them also do a really good job, especially after we take a loss, just trying to balance out the team to talk about, okay, well, what went wrong? What didn't? We know this is normal. Losing isn't the end of the world. So it's okay. What do we need to do better next time so that doesn't happen again, right? From my experience, it's been amazing working with both of them so far. I'm happy to have them.
Great. Yeah, I was definitely interested in specifically asking what kind of the reactions to a loss kind of thing, both from the coaching side of it, but also the way the veterans handle it. What's kind of the approach or the process of giving feedback, particularly after a loss, helping maybe the players who, might be newer to the league, understand the right way to react to that, maybe even to react to outside feedback that comes when they have a bad game or have a loss, like. What's the right way to kind of manage the learning process in coordination with, I guess, the ego or the confidence level that might take a hit?
Sure. I mean, it's different when you're talking about a loss with a veteran or a young player. In a lot of cases, with the veterans, they know when they mess up on stage. So there's a lot of times you don't really need to hammer in and be like, okay, this was just a silly mistake. They know. But for our team in particular, I think a lot of it comes down to us talking about things before it happens. So from our perspective, yeah, we know we'll take losses with the development roster. That's not like shocking. We're not expecting to win every single game. And it's just trying to prep everyone's mindset for understanding that it's not the end of the world. What's important is going on stage, getting a feel for what's happening, thinking about how you're executing and on what your plan was going into it, and then thinking about what you need to think about going into practice or the next LCS, the next game. In our case, I think we've been doing a really good job where when the games end, win or lose, it's still the same process where we're sitting down, we're going over the game. Even in our wins, there's a lot of sloppy moments, so there's a lot of things that we need to go over. And I think we're trying to find fun in like that process and trying to figure out how to problem solve and knowing that there's a long way to go. So I feel like a lot of it just comes down to making sure you're giving everyone time to be able to process their emotions, give them time to be able to talk about what their perspective is, and trying to do, for me specifically, trying to do the best job I can to get them on the same page so they're hearing each other. I would also say ever since we brought on Mabry, I think he does a fantastic job just trying to go over a lot of the general macro that I think we were lacking before. And we have a pretty good system where we can sit down, go over a game together, talk about the mistakes that are just stupid and don't make sense, and be able to laugh about it and be like, okay, we know what went wrong here. Let's just make sure it doesn't happen again.
Something I've been really curious about with a lot of different coaches recently is the feedback process and the review process specifically, and the balance of focus on identifying and learning from mistakes versus kind of positive reinforcement. Like, hey, this was a good play, and kind of celebrating that and reinforcing the play that way. Is that something that you have a certain approach to, or do you tend to focus more on reviewing mistakes? Do you have any intentionality around positive reinforcement, or what does that balance look like for you guys?
I would say I think we have a pretty good balance of doing both, to be honest. I definitely like to be able to have positive reinforcement. I think when you see how much the pressure and negativity can impact a team's performance, you start to realize how important it is just to make sure that the guys are remembering the game is supposed to be fun. And I think in League of Legends specifically, there's this culture of being incredibly nitpicky because the smallest details do inevitably matter. But when those things add up and you're only talking about negative things and things that are going wrong, I think it's pretty easy for a player or a team just to feel overwhelmed. Like there's just so many things that we're bad at. So you just try to balance those things. In the review process, you have key points that you want to focus on based on what you plan for that day or that week, as far as concepts you want to go over. When your players are executing on those things or the team's executing, you want to be able to point those things out to say, hey, this is what progress looks like. This is really good. Keep doing this. But also balancing out when there's things that aren't going wrong, right? I think there's a balance. I don't think it's just, you're always positive and you're ignoring negatives, but I also don't think you can only focus on all the mistakes and expect the team to not fall apart.
Does that review process look very different, like between scrims and stage games? Like obviously I expect it looks different to a certain extent, but like, do you have a completely different approach when it's post scrim versus after an LCS day?
I don't think so. I think the only big difference is the way it works is from a coaching perspective, because we're working remote, we're not watching the games live on a spectator client. In scrims, you're sitting there and you're watching and you're taking notes and you can go back and you can check something. And then when you're going into that review process, you're hitting your concepts, but you're also more sure about exactly what went wrong because you've got to look at it again. In the live games, a lot of what I'm focusing on is just listening to the comms, and I'm not paying attention to the stream as much because there's so much delay in the game. So it's a bit different where after the game, you kind of sit down as a team and you're going it over together kind of for the second time, I guess, with fresh eyes. But the conversational tones and the things that we're talking about, it's very similar because we're pointing out, hey, we're talking about these concepts this week leading up to this, right? Here's what you did well, or here's where we messed up. This looks just like our scrims. So I don't think it's drastically different.
So to summarize a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here, I think the roster you guys have, the way you're approaching things with them, the kinds of coaching you're doing with them, what do you see as kind of the ceiling for this team? And what are your kind of competitive goals, say, for spring and for summer?
I mean, it's hard to say for ceiling. I think I'm always on the end where I just have a lot of faith and confidence in my players, where in my head, I think we're just capable of beating anyone. That being said, you should always be reasonable for expectations. You don't want to put unrealistic expectations on a team or players, especially when they're younger. For us, I think we're capable of making a good playoff run. I think for spring, that's definitely what I'm aiming for, is just to be able to get some experience in best of series after the regular season, build our way up. So by the time we're finishing summer, we're trying to figure out how close we are in contention for Worlds.
Do you look at the season ever, and whether you say it to the rest of the team or not, do you look at like, hey, finishing top 4 in summer, or going to Worlds, like that's the goal, and if I don't get there, then the season's a failure? Like, do you have, given that you are in kind of this division lead kind of a role, do you set overarching goals like that for yourselves for what would constitute the bar you need to pass?
I don't think we're thinking about it in that strict of a sense, I would say. I think individually, I'm always the type where I want to be able to perform even if I feel like everyone's doubting us. I think that really shined through in Golden Guardian Spring 2019 when we became the first team to start 0-4 and make a playoff run. And in my head, despite how bad things felt or how bleak it looked being 0-4, in my head, it's like, I know we can beat teams. I know we can rattle off wins and we can make a playoff run, which is what we did. I think it's similar here. My goal this entire time is to be able to build a roster that I think people can get excited about, to be able to contend internationally. That's something that I haven't got to experience myself going to Worlds yet. And I think that's always been my goal. Even when I'm talking to Afram and Dardoch from the beginning, even if we're talking about bringing on development pieces, the idea is we're getting these pieces because we think we can win with them. We think we're going to be taking time to get better, but in the end, we feel like we should be able to compete. But it's not the same to say, like, you go to young players and say, you have to make Worlds or you're a failure, or this wasn't a good split, And I think when you look at it from a top-down perspective too, and you look at things like investment or what the projections were, and if you overperform things like this, Dignitas is giving us a runway to be able to be like, okay, let's develop, give them time to figure out what they're doing, and then if they're overly competitive this year, it's just a plus, it's a cherry on top. So we're trying to lean into having those lower expectations to be able to give us a bit more freedom, which is something that I think a lot of teams or a lot of top teams don't really have. I guess there's just a lot more pressure in general to perform now. And I think that ends up negatively impacting players' growth more often than not. But yeah, I mean, expectations are definitely make a playoff run. Try to show people that they're wrong about a few of my players.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, do you guys ever at that kind of that upper end level of the organization, do you ever talk about kind of I guess what you could call the Cloud9 model of building players up and earning buyouts for them, and kind of building the future of the org to some extent that way? Like, and I guess the more holistic way of viewing it would be developing enough talent throughout the entire org that you can afford to sell some players and hold on to the ones you want the most, rather than only having 5 players that you actually want to move forward with.
Sure.
Is that an approach that you guys talk about at all, or is it something that's just kind of out in the edges of things?
I would say based on when I was joining the org, I feel like there wasn't a lot of runway to go that in depth as far as focusing on academy, amateur, and LCS. When the LCS project is development, it's kind of, I would say, I think it took a lot of my focus and my time. But you can tell with all the teams signing up an academy, or you have your academy team and then teams opting into having an amateur program. You can tell that from top down, people are spending more time thinking about this and the value of if you can raise up players and then you can sell them, sure. For me, I think it's still something that I'm getting comfortable with, because in my head, when I have players that I'm really invested in, it's the last thing I'm thinking about is selling them and giving them to someone else. But that's part of the business, and if you're able to raise up players from amateur to academy to LCS, and either they become stable pieces for you, or you're able to sell them or bundle them to make money to finance your next roster, I mean, there's definitely an advantage to doing that, right?
Yeah, there are, I think, pros and cons, and I think the ideal is that an org wants to be in the position where they can make those choices, right? Where they have options and they can say, we're going to go this direction because it will be good for the financial perspective, or we can go this direction, it's a little better for competitive. I think there's another angle on it all, though, of like the building the reputation and the brand of the organization to make players want to play there, right? And to give you more clout in free agency, that maybe you could offer equal money, but they choose to come to you because you're the org they want to play for. And that plays into the kind of, I guess, the pressure sometimes of feeling like you need to sell a player rather than letting them walk in free agency later. Is that something that you guys have talked about? And I think you have mentioned, in terms of building the brand of the org, and so on, that it seems like it's something that has been, at least to some extent, on your radar.
Yeah, we definitely talked about these things. A big thing that I talk about is, outside of just the salaries that you're offering to players, I think it's just really important to think of the big picture and just how you're treating players and how they feel when they're playing for your org. Ideally, you want players that are genuinely proud of where they're playing, and a lot of that just bleeds out into the other players, where people talk about what their experiences were like there, and then, like you said, it comes down to attracting talent. That's always going to be the most important thing, is can you actually get those players to want to play for your org if you value them highly, right? So this is something that in my role, especially being more involved at a managerial level as well, outside of just the game aspect, it's something that I'm really thinking about as far as, okay, well, how do we build Dignitas up to be an org where players want to play here? Because they think they can win now, or they think that we'll be able to develop them in time to be able to win, right?
Can you give any examples of specific like little projects or things that you might do that would be aimed at kind of increasing like the likelihood of a player wanting to play for you?
I would say part of it, outside of, like I said, outside of what you're offering in salaries, I think part of it just comes down to the structure that you're providing as far as, what their housing looks like as an example, and trying to build out an area that's comfortable for them, or letting players know that you're invested in their time outside of the game, where you're not just trying to burn them out. You're really focused. I think a lot of orgs are talking about this, where there's a lot of focus on mental and physical health, trying to make sure that the players feel like not only are they humans, but they're not just like pieces to be moved around. I think that's a really big thing that's been lacking for a while, where there's just a lot of turnover and there's a lot of mistrust between players and orgs in general. And a lot of that also comes down to just trying to be what I would say transparent to a fault, is an approach that, again, this is something that Dana and I would talk about at Golden Guardians, where I would rather be on the side where we're being openly transparent about what's going on to players so they understand the decisions and why things happen. This is something that I think some of the other teams aren't doing. And it's something that I think when players get to know me a little bit more, it starts to make a lot more sense what I'm about and what I want to build, what my ideals are, what my goals are. And I think a lot of that feeds into players eventually wanting to be a part of what I'm building.
In your experience, what does the balance look like between kind of those factors of compensation and work life balance and the comfortable work environment, all that kind of stuff, against the potential to win? And I'm sure it depends on the individual player, but a lot of them would be motivated by, I'm going to go wherever I think I have the best chance of winning a trophy or going to Worlds or stuff like that. Like, how do those things, to what extent are they kind of 50-50? Are they balanced differently than that?
I mean, the competitive side is always going to be more when it comes to a player. Everyone wants to win. And a lot of what I'm talking about, wanting to develop and get to a point where I feel like we're competitive and how that bleeds into branding, it's what I'm trying to build, right? Mm-hmm. It just takes time. It's not something where, unless you're coming in and you want to throw $15 million at a roster and just say, okay, yeah, we have a roster that wins now. I think there's a more sustainable way to go about doing that. I think this is something that Golden Guardians did super well when they brought in players that I think were undervalued globally. And then you start to see, once those players start to perform, the narrative changes, right? Initially, when I joined Golden Guardians, that team was a back-to-back 10th place team. We make a good playoff run, and we switch players out. This last year, Golden Guardians did even better. And you start to see what that long-term plan looks like, that I think most people are, just uncomfortable in general when it comes to developing. I think everyone loves to say, yeah, we'd love to see new talent. But then when you see the actual process, people don't like the actual process until you just win. It's like there's a lot of recency bias that I think goes into that. But in my mind, yeah, I mean, it comes down to being able to have a team that people know is competitive, and then you'll draw talent, and then you try to build out around that as far as the infrastructure and everything that goes into a player in addition to that.
So another bit of a gear shift here, and I think we talk about it peripherally, but how do you see the role of academy in your org, and how does it play into kind of that overarching kind of building up what your org is working towards? And I think people would look at academy teams. Usually, they look at it as it could be the best development opportunity. So a lot of young players that you're trying to grow into the next LCS players. It could be kind of players that are meant to push your LCS starters and threaten to take their spots, and give them kind of some competitive pressure. It could be some, maybe another approach. How do you guys see it in your team?
Sure. So I think for both teams, it's similar as far as having a balance between veteran players and a couple young players with less experience. On our academy team, we have more guys that have been playing, who've had LCS experience and more academy experience in general. And then we have young guys like Spawn that are just straight out of solo queue. I think you want to have a balance where you always have a couple pieces that you're trying to develop. But at the same time, you want a roster that's relatively competitive so you can practice internally, or you can get a good read on different metas. Especially when you consider how the practice schedule's changed, where you're only getting 3 days of scrims, there's a lot of value to being able to pay attention to what your academy team is practicing. It's really valuable having players that can talk across both teams. As far as like a team culture, and something that I really want to be able to build out, is having players that are more involved across academy and LCS. I think oftentimes there's a divide between both, and there's not really a lot of interactions. But the ideal is you're developing, but you also have a team that can compete with your LCS team to a level, or to a certain extent. And then in addition to that, that level under that is amateur and feeding into that, right? I think teams are still trying to figure out what this process looks like. They're trying to figure out how you want to build out both of those, and then what long-term plans look like. But I would say pretty much I think that's like the direction for Dignitas. Invert's been doing a good job trying to build out academy and building out a team that he thinks can compete and still be able to build up new talent. So yeah, I think so far Dignitas has a good starting point for what we're trying to work towards.
We've got a question here, and it's one that came from a listener, and that I think a lot of people coming into this and paying attention to what's been happening in Dignitas wanted to know about this. And so I am not the NSA asked, how is the coaching staff managing Dardoch's unique pick every game? Is it a team thing, or is it purely player driven?
I would say it's both, but a lot of it is going to come down to Dardoch and just champion pools in general. It's going to come down to experience, what he's playing in solo queue, when he sees different angles for things that can be good. Like I mentioned before, a big part of what we wanted to build at Dig was having players that could have fun together and could try to figure out a way that they want to be able to play the game. A lot of times in isolation, we see a good angle for a matchup that could work, and then that builds out to, okay, well, what does this champion need to be able to succeed, right? What do you want in other lanes to be able to balance it out, or how does this champion want to function or play? I think a lot of times people tunnel on strictly what's meta globally and the things that are most common that pop up a ton. But when you realize how many champions in the game, there's a lot more variability you can throw in. You just need to have a good game plan around it, right? It's not always going to be successful. A lot of times there's going to be volatility in some of those picks and how the matchups work. But for our end, we want our guys to be able to be confident to try things and to take risks, because I think it does give us an edge compared to a lot of other teams. With Josh specifically, I spent a lot of time with him just talking about champion picks or drafts and how we think the game works. So a lot of it is just getting on the same page where we trust each other to be like, yeah, this is a good angle. I think the Kane game this last weekend was a pretty good example when you look at it, where a lot of people weren't playing Kane. Enemy team drafts 5 range champions, and you're like, yeah, I think this is a Kane angle. And you can tell when the team is just more excited or on board to want to try it, and you can feel that energy kind of shifting around those picks. So it's definitely something that's unique to us.
Is it something that, like, it sounds like, from talking about having fun and talking about different champion angles and so on, it sounds like this is something you guys are pretty intentionally aware of, that he's picking a different champion every game. Is that something that, is it more about that and just trying to have fun with the team and also trying to catch opponents off guard? Or is it more about setting up in the future that, opponents are now going to have to come in and do a lot harder prep work, and you're kind of putting them on the back foot of they have no idea what Dardoch is going to play, so they have to work a lot harder?
I mean, to be clear, our strategy is definitely not, okay, this weekend we can't pick the same champion we picked last weekend. Like, that's not what we're trying to do. Every time we're picking these champions, there's a reason for it and why we think it's good in that specific situation. That being said, it does give you a competitive advantage when your team is not just drafting the exact same way over and over again, right? I think this is something that NA does tend to default to, where you get comfortable and you think in absolutes for there being one correct answer for your draft and what you pick at certain times. But I want teams to be annoyed when they're prepping for us, where it's not so easy to be like, oh yeah, this is for sure what their 1 through 3 is going to look like in draft, because that does give you an advantage on stage. Sometimes even if you're picking something that's not super optimal, but your team's comfortable and practiced on it and the enemy hasn't seen it, you can find advantages and you can pick up wins that way, right? But for us, the big thing we've just talked about from the beginning was we want to be flexible. We want to be able to try different styles, and we don't want teams to look at us and say, okay, well, they can only do this, or this guy can only play these 3 champions, which is the case for some pros in NA.
Yeah, I think we'll be very interested to see how long kind of the streak of picking different champions will continue. That's going to be fun to watch. Hopefully you guys don't force it too hard. And it sounds like you're not intending that, but it is fun to watch from the fan perspective, that's for sure. In future, if people want to contribute questions for episodes like these, we do post them on patreon.com/oracleselixir, and you can contribute your questions for other guests in the future as well. To wrap a lot of this off, Jimmy, I think people look at teams that are maybe projected to be in the lower, 3-4 teams, or maybe just lower half of the LCS, and they might more naturally gravitate towards cheering for the top half of teams. What are the reasons that fans should be really excited about cheering for Dignitas and following their progress this year?
I would say this Dignitas is a completely different look than what Dignitas was last year, in my opinion. I think we'd like to play a much more fast-paced game. We're going to try a lot of different strategies in draft. We're not going to default to just one style. And I think there's something compelling to be said for that underdog story where, yeah, most people doubt us and don't really have high expectations. And there's a lot of fun in us coming together and wanting to prove people wrong, wanting to show a little bit of our style and what we can do differently. I don't think we're going to play boring games. I think we're going to have some entertaining champion picks that are going to catch people off guard. Yeah, and I think it'll be a good story. I mean, like you said, most people project us to be bottom half. So far, we've played some of the weaker teams, but you can see we're sitting in third place, tied with TSM. And I think that's already a lot better than what people would have expected for us. But I hope people just keep watching because there's going to be ups and downs. My expectation is we're not just going to end up in first place for sure. And I'm not just going to sit here and just say, yeah, we'll be top tier, screw you. I don't think that's the approach. But I'm hoping Dignitas fans will kind of gravitate towards what we're building. We want to be a team that has fun together and actually plays the game as a unit.
Great. Well, good luck with all of that and with the upcoming matches. Good luck with figuring out the champion pools you're going to bring in and surprising people. What is the best way for people to follow you and your work with the team?
I don't really do much on social media, so I don't know if you really want to follow me. I think my Twitter tag is just Jimmy Harrison, so you can add me there. Other than that, just pay attention to my players. That's what I want people to focus on. I think that I have a lot of really talented players that have so many different strengths that they can show. Check out all of their Twitters, not mine.
All right. Well, we'll make sure that your Twitter is in the show notes, and people can look up Dignitas and find the players that way, and pay attention to what they're building, what they're working towards, and it should be exciting. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today, Jimmy. And to everyone listening, you can support the TrueSight podcast at patreon.com/oracleselixir. You can subscribe on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as at anchor.fm/TrueSight. And make sure you check out the Oracle's Elixir Discord server, where we talk a lot about League of Legends esports and other esports titles, data science, and a lot of other topics. Links for all of those will be in the show notes as well. This has been the TrueSight podcast with Jimmy Harrison, and I'm Tim Sevenhusen. Thanks for listening.